pleasure to introduce Erik Edstrom. Erik grew up in Stoughton, Massachusetts, graduated from West Point in 2007. Erik was deployed to Afghanistan, where he served as an infantry platoon leader, spent the remainder of his service as the presidential escort platoon leader during the Obama administration. He's a graduate of the U.S. Army Ranger School, recipient of the Ripito Trophy during the Best Ranger competition, and was selected for the U.S. Special Forces and awarded the Bronze Star Medal. After the military, Erik went on to earn both an MBA and a Master of Science, studying climate change from Oxford University. After grad school, Erik moved to Australia for 5 years, where he worked as a management consultant for both Boston Consulting Group and McKinsey. He lives in Boston and is a member of Massachusetts Peace Action. In his book, Un-American, A Soldier's Reckoning for Our Longest War, he explains how blind support for war exacerbates the problems that it's intended to resolve, devastates the people allegedly being helped, and diverts assets from far larger threats like climate change. Erik, the floor is yours. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks, David. And thank you, Valerie. To everyone here, thank you so much for taking a bit of time out this evening to join us. It's apropos. I have been very much plugged in to everything that is happening these days in Afghanistan. I have, in a way, sort of rejoined, if only briefly, my military colleagues, as they have put forth a tremendous amount of effort round the clock in this frenetic frenzy of attempts to get our Afghan interpreters and other Afghan allies, as well as American citizens, out of the country after an absolute catastrophically disastrous evacuation process led by the US. And I have been a part of that for basically the last sort of 10 days. I was invited into sort of one of these secret spook signal groups to try to help coordinate getting American citizens to the gate and to fill in the gaps and the holes of where there's been absolutely no coordination whatsoever. And it's been truly disastrous to see the effects of poor planning, and especially poor military planning, which, unlike some other forms of public service, reverberates and ripples through society much more deeply and causes much more damage than perhaps other forms of service. And so when the military tries to get out of Afghanistan in a way that is extremely detrimental, it causes a lot of extra harm to the rest of society. And I've seen that through glimpses in these discussion groups and everything else. So I'll take a few minutes to talk about that, and then I'll actually sort of get to the major prompt, which is some of the lessons learned. But because I've spent basically all of my waking hours outside of work trying to help my interpreter get out, I feel a certain debt that I should explain what that situation entails. And it sort of, I think, can go back to the beginning, which I don't think anyone here, given this is mass peace action, would object to the idea that going into Afghanistan with a large conventional footprint to occupy the country for 2 decades was a good idea. I certainly don't think that was the case either. I was, absolutely in favor and wrote a book about it, obviously called Un-American, about getting out of Afghanistan and ending that war. And I knew about that and felt that very personally over a decade ago in 2009 and 2010 when I was deployed. But given that this is where we are now, and you need to get out of the country, you would like to do so in a way that causes the least amount of additional damage to the people that live there and the least amount of damage to those that have served with us, and that we still owe some moral obligation to take care of, because we strung them out and we've strung them along for years with the expectation that they would eventually come to the United States. And so rather than doing appropriate capacity planning as a country, as a military, and to plan this, we did not look at the number of people that needed to be evacuated by location. and sort that out so that you knew how many and what type American citizens, P2 visas, SIVs, by region. We could have used those regional airports to get those interpreters that have been in bureaucratic purgatory through the State Department awaiting their visa. We could have gotten them out safely over time, and we didn't. And so what happened as the US collapsed their regional bases and gave up and fled those and left only a single point in and out of the country, at Kabul airfield, at Hamid Karzai International Airport, is that you've forced people like my interpreter, who had to go across the country from Taliban-controlled Kunduz in the middle of the night to get to Kabul. And day after day, I've been trying to support him from over here to help him try to get through a gate and get on a manifest to get out of the country. I've called Congressman Lynch's office many times before. I met with him in 2017. I literally talked to the man about the same interpreter and the same problem and the same bureaucratic purgatory he was facing with the special immigrant visa in his office at Rayburn House on Capitol Hill in 2017. It is now 2021, and the same man is still stuck in the visa process with the State Department, and he is not on a plane, and he was left behind by the United States. So there's a, I'm happy to point fingers when it comes to the war and how it was completely negative sum. But in the last couple of weeks, that has not been my objective. My objective has been trying to get those people to safety. And I think the coalition of veterans, community organizers, human rights advocates, there's people from UNICEF, there's former, chief of staff from the cabinet secretary, basically, is part of the same group. And I think there's a tremendous sense of failure and betrayal that at the end of these 2 decades of conflict, we couldn't even have the common decency as a country to bring our allies home. And we've left them to figure it out on their own. And it's not going to be a pretty situation. I was on MSNBC on Saturday and talked very briefly on a short spot about what I've been participating in. And from a White House correspondent who went on background, could not give her name, but that the State Department has been padding the numbers of the evacuees, counting not people on airplanes, rather they've been counting empty seats and counting seats on aircraft and making assumptions about what those occupancy levels are. And the people that are granted a visa were being counted, not the people that actually made it through the gates onto planes. And so I was told that if you look into, and I hope that there's a staff journalist at a major tier 1 paper that will look into it, but that the numbers don't match. So the number that the US claims was flown from Kabul to, say, Qatar, and the number that left Qatar to come to the US are vastly disparate. So there's a large portion that you're like, well, where did they go? Did suddenly there come this renaissance where the Qataris now want to take all these refugees? And the answer is no. The answer is that they were never there to begin with, and that the numbers that were reported are padded. That being said, depending on how one classifies an Afghan ally, on the sort of bottom end, we've left probably 75% of our allies behind. And if you're counting the broadest spectrum of Afghan allies that you could, which would include not only SIV applicants that are pending and those that have been approved and their direct family members, but if you keep going out another layer where you have, say their parents and other brothers and sisters, or if you include the P2 visas, like anyone that has served in the Afghan army or Afghan commandos or contractors to the US, that number can go up to about 1.2 million. So if we've evacuated 70,000 people, of which we still don't really know if that's the true number, out of 1.2 million, it's something less than or thereabouts near 7%. That means that on the broadest spectrum, if you draw a liberal line around what we consider an ally and who deserves to be evacuated and who doesn't, we've left 93% of our allies behind. And I think that that's absolutely shameful. So yes, there are a lot of lessons on here, but because I've been so deep in it, I also actually wrote an article for Politico last week, which I can drop in the chat bar here for everyone. I published this, I think, on Wednesday of last week, which got some decent traction, but it shows the absolute chaos on this side. And I think that there's almost, it was in some ways actually really nice to participate in that effort. And because it's sort of a somber tone, because the reason it was nice is because it felt a bit redemptive relative to all of the other things that I did in Afghanistan when I was deployed. And that here was something that felt uncontroversially human. That, you know, what I could do in the last 2 weeks seemed like an absolute positive outcome for these people. And we didn't get that. So I'm still a bit shaken up from all of that myself. So it's been a hard time. I'm happy we're out of the country, but I think it was done in an absolutely disastrous way. To comment on some of the other lessons that were here, there's probably two that I want to add, actually. There's 7 here on the list. I think that there's probably room for 2 more, one of which would be around providing truth and transparency in US military greenhouse emissions, committing to the reduction targets in line with the 1.5 degree world, the Paris Accords, and then basically ensuring that out of the military budget for the cost of emissions, that you would claw that back for every ton that is emitted by the military and then reallocate that towards mitigation and abatement. So if, you know, the more you spend in emissions, the less budget you get, and make that very clear that they're tied together. And then that forces the military to decarbonize quite quickly. You know, I recognize that that creates then the next generation of military industrial complex, which is basically then, oh yeah, this whole, you know, climate change is a thing. We should absolutely decarbonize the military. Let us design for you an entire new fleet of EV trucks and MRAPs. So, you know, that will then, you know, pass it on, you know, to the next generation in costs as well. But nonetheless, I mean, it's still good to decarbonize, and I still think that they should pay the cost, because ultimately it doesn't matter where a ton of carbon is emitted. The, you know, atmosphere counts it all the same, whether it's from a C-17 or a pickup truck, or, you know, from cattle farming and agriculture. So it all needs to be counted, it all needs to be assessed, and it should all be paid for the negative externalities. I'd say also number 9, another one I'd create, is show the world that the US actually believes in the rule of law and believes in justice by conducting a comprehensive, independent, third-party, a la ICC, International Criminal Court investigation to prosecute war criminals, and seek the full support to try to make amends for what has been done and what has been glossed over in the last 2 decades. The other 2 things that I would say, to be more precise, and this might be contentious for some people, is that with number 2, pay reparations to the Afghan people for the harm we have caused. Frankly, I don't think that that would work. And I actually would be against that, because I think we should pay for some of the reparations, not because we are callous, but because whatever the market rate is, and we should assess Afghan lives no different than our own, would be so expensive that it would bankrupt our entire country. That if you look at the cost it has been over 20 years, it is not due to a lack of caring, but the damage that has been done is so large, I don't even know how sort of the country would function. And if you want to play the sort of card of let's pay for reparations, where does it begin and end? I mean, I think that there's plenty of reason for reparations for women more broadly, or Black people more broadly. And then you're ending up basically making our country entirely insolvent because of past moral and actual crimes it has committed. So where I do think that there is probably some room, especially as I witnessed when I was in the military in Afghanistan, is that oftentimes the military would not pay out, or pay out in very paltry sums to people harmed by American vehicles, bombs, or accidents more broadly. And all of those people deserve to get paid. I think it's just an absolute nightmare to actually, in reality, do reparations for the country more broadly. So I think that one's a bit tricky. And with respect to the accept all Afghan refugees, I would further refine that because sort of what is a refugee? It's been drilled into me for the last sort of 2 weeks that they're not refugees, that they're evacuees, and that refugees carry some negative connotations with certain people, and they, are more likely to be rebuffed in terms of welcome to their country. But I would say that all eligible Afghan evacuees, including special immigrant visas, those who are pending, their dependents and extended family, and anyone who is eligible for a P2 visa, which is a different classification, which would include sort of contractors, Afghan army, Afghan police, and anyone who had been providing services to the US military throughout this entire period of time. So those are my 2 additions, my 2 modifications, and a brief sort of digression on what I've been up to for the last couple of weeks. And I thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, Eric. And thanks for those unique insights, especially for calling out the largest polluter and carbon contributor in the world, the US military. I don't know that anyone has the perfect answer for it, but calling out the problem is probably step one. And thank you for mentioning, and Valentine also for mentioning the investigations that never occurred in the wake of the Iraq debacle. And a friend of mine, Hassan El-Tayeb, who runs the Middle East Policy Desk at the Friends Committee on National Legislation, wrote recently, if careers are not destroyed over the lies and misinformation about Afghanistan, then we've got a problem. Anyway, and the delabeling of refugees. So thanks, Eric. I thought that was great.
If I could actually add one more thing, David, it's that
Sure.
I spoke at Veterans for Peace a couple of weeks back about military and climate change. And there was a study in Nature Communication, it was all over The Guardian, et cetera, which talked about lifetime emissions of US citizens. And it was a study that said, basically for every 3 US citizens, and there are 223 people here on this call, so we'll say that's roughly sort of 70. So for every 3, it's 3.5 US citizens over the course of their lifetime, they will emit enough emissions to kill 1 person somewhere else. And that's the social cost of carbon aspect. So the negative externalities associated with the emissions will be felt somewhere in the world. And because the US per capita footprint is so high, that effectively the people on this call, if we're all average polluters, have effectively killed 70 people somewhere else. So it's the magic number that the Social Cost of Carbon Project in Nature Communications said it's about 4,400 tons. Usually sort of an average American is between sort of 16 and 20 tons a year. If everyone lives 80 years, you do the quick back of the envelope math. The interesting thing connecting it to the US military is what is the military's emissions. And that is shocking. Science Magazine had, again, they don't report it, so it's really difficult. And that's why you need congressional action to have transparency in military emissions. One such group of scientists that were trying to estimate footprints based on JP8 and petroleum purchases and base estimations of 80 countries across the US or across the globe, basically ended up getting to a number, and it was in the hundreds of millions of tons over a several-year window, which would basically be the equivalent of an operating social cost of carbon of killing another 130,000 people. And that was just about like an 8-year span during the War on Terror. So the number of people who will eventually and likely forecasted to be killed from just the emissions alone is going to rival the actual number of people, according to Brown University's Watson Institute, that were killed from the war. So it almost makes war doubly costly in a human sense because of these carbon emissions.
Thanks, Eric. Thank you.